The war had raged across the galaxy for years. Alien species, once thought to be unbeatable, had wiped out entire fleets. Every attempt to stop them had failed. The last hope for the galaxy's allies lay in sending a distress signal, but even that seemed like a desperate measure. The Council of Galactic Defense had called for aid from every corner of the galaxy, but no one had come through. It was then that a message from Earth arrived, a simple but clear offer. "We are sending a fleet." At first, no one believed it. The humans had been known for their ingenuity, but their military fleet was old and small. The galaxy's allies had long since lost faith in humanity's ability to contribute meaningfully to the war effort. But the Council, desperate, had no other choice. They gave the human fleet the green light to enter the war zone. The human fleet was unlike anything the galaxy's military forces had seen. It wasn't made up of sleek, powerful warships equipped with the latest technology. Instead, the humans had sent an assortment of old, battered ships, each one showing signs of wear and tear. The ships looked as though they had been salvaged from scrapyards and repaired with whatever parts could be found. Too many, it seemed like the humans were sending a token gesture, something to show that they had tried, but nothing that would make a real difference. The enemy forces, aware of the arrival of a new fleet, were uninterested in the humans. They laughed at the sight of the approaching ships. Yeah? The fleet was small, poorly equipped, and slow. The enemy commanders were confident that this would be an easy battle. They had crushed fleets much larger than this one. The sight of these primitive ships only fueled their belief that the humans would quickly crumble. Under pressure, the human fleet entered the war zone under the watchful eyes of the enemy. The first thing the commanders of the galactic allies noticed was how calm the humans were. Despite their ships being outclassed and outnumbered, the human fleet didn't waver. There was no panic, no sign of fear. The humans were determined and focused, their crews working with quiet precision as they prepared for battle. On the alien side, the enemy continued to mock the human ships, believing that they would never last. "They'll break under our fire," one alien general said, sneering at the humans. "Their ships are outdated, their weapons weak. It's only a matter of time before they're gone." But as the battle began, something strange happened. The human ships, though slow and seemingly vulnerable, moved in a way that the enemy hadn't expected. They didn't follow the usual tactics that the aliens had grown accustomed to. Instead, the humans used their ships' unique designs and the unpredictable tactics they had perfected over the years to surprise the enemy. While the enemy focused on trying to take down the larger, more powerful ships, the humans launched a series of surprise attacks. Their smaller ships darted in and out of the enemy fleet, exploiting weaknesses and dealing damage that the aliens hadn't anticipated. It was as though the humans knew exactly where to strike, targeting weak points that the aliens had overlooked. The galaxy's allies watched in stunned silence as the human fleet began to make progress. The humans' old ships, though outmatched, in terms of firepower, were being used in ways no one had ever seen before. The enemy's fleet, which had been so sure of victory, began to falter. The leader of the human fleet, Captain Harris, stood on the bridge of his ship, eyes fixed on the screen as he monitored the battle. He knew this was only the beginning. The human fleet had a plan, a strategy that no one had expected. It wasn't about power, it was about precision. Every ship, every maneuver had been carefully calculated to turn the tide of the war. "Keep pushing," Captain Harris ordered calmly, his voice steady. "We're not here to be heroes, we're here to win." Despite their small numbers, the human fleet began to make a dent in the enemy's ranks. The aliens, caught off guard by the humans' unconventional tactics, started to lose ground. The enemy was confused. They had never faced an opponent like this before. The humans were fighting with an intensity and resolve that made it clear they would not back down easily. As the battle raged on, the humans continued to hold their ground, slowly but surely breaking through the alien defenses. The once overwhelming alien fleet began to show signs of disarray. They were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. It was as if the arrival of the human fleet had thrown their entire war strategy into chaos. On the galactic side, the Allies couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had expected the human fleet to be wiped out in the first few moments of battle, but instead, they were watching as the humans brought down ship after ship. The humans had taken a fleet thought to be weak, and with their tactics, they were turning it into a powerful force. The battle was far from over. But one thing was clear. Humanity had just shown the galaxy something it hadn't seen before. An enemy who had once believed that the humans were nothing more than a distraction were now beginning to realize that they had made a grave mistake. As the battle continued to unfold, the human fleet found itself in the heart of the war zone, surrounded by an overwhelming number of enemy ships. The alien forces, believing their victory was guaranteed, prepared to crush the small human fleet. But the humans, far from being intimidated, stood their ground with quiet confidence. The enemy fleet moved in, their ships large and powerful, with advanced weapons that could obliterate anything in their path. They fired their first barrage. A wave of energy blasts and missiles aimed at the human ships. It seemed like an unstoppable force, and for a moment, it looked as though the human fleet would be quickly overwhelmed. But Captain Harris, leading the human fleet, remained calm as he watched the enemy's attack on his screens. He knew what was coming. He had planned for this. "All ships prepare for evasive maneuvers," he commanded, his voice steady but full of purpose. The human fleet responded immediately. The older ships, though slower than the enemy's, were far more agile than anyone had anticipated. With swift precision, the humans moved in unpredictable patterns. They weren't fighting head-on. They were moving as one, working together to avoid the worst of the enemy's fire. The enemy couldn't believe their eyes. The human ships darted in and out of range, evading their blasts with almost impossible accuracy. Each alien ship that fired a shot missed, and the humans were able to return fire, hitting critical areas on the alien ships. The enemy tried to adjust, but they couldn't keep up with the humans' unpredictable tactics. One by one, the human ships picked off the alien vessels. They didn't use brute force, but instead relied on their knowledge of the war zone and their ship's unique capabilities. The human fleet was using every advantage they had, no matter how small, to stay one step ahead. It wasn't about having the biggest guns. It was about knowing where to strike and when. On the bridge of the lead human ship, Captain Harris watched as the enemy's confidence began to falter. He could see the shift in the battle, and he knew this was the moment too. "Push harder. All ships, target their engines," he ordered. "Take out their ability to retreat." The humans adjusted their fire and began to strike at the enemy's engines. With well-placed shots, they disabled several ships, leaving them stranded in space. The enemy fleet's formation began to break apart, their previously coordinated attacks now chaotic and disorganized. The humans, on the other hand, seemed more united than ever, each ship moving with purpose and precision. Despite being outnumbered, the humans were slowly but surely making a difference. Their older ships were holding up surprisingly well against the alien assault. The enemy's advanced weaponry wasn't as effective as they had hoped, and their ships were being taken down faster than they could replace them. Each explosion that rocked the enemy's fleet was a sign that the humans weren't backing down. The galaxy's allies, watching from a safe distance, were starting to realize something incredible. The humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving. What had started as a small and seemingly hopeless mission was now turning into something much more significant. The humans had brought a level of chaos to the battlefield that the aliens couldn't handle. The alien commanders, who had once laughed at the human fleet's arrival, were no longer smiling. They were scrambling to adjust their tactics, but the humans were always one step ahead. The aliens' attacks were becoming more desperate, their ships now retreating or trying to regroup in panic. The humans, however, were relentless. Ship they destroyed seemed to make them more determined. Captain Harris could feel the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the humans against the enemy anymore. It was a fight for survival, and humanity was proving it had the strength to win. The human fleet wasn't just a force to be reckoned with. They were showing the entire galaxy that underestimating humanity was a mistake no one should make again. Stay focused. Everyone, Captain Harris said into the comms, his voice calm but full of authority. We're not finished yet. They're on the run, but we need to push them back fully. The human fleet continued to press forward. With every passing minute, the enemy fleet grew weaker. Their once-proud ships now drifting aimlessly or being picked off by the human attackers. The one certain victory for the aliens was slipping through their fingers, and they were beginning to realize that this battle wasn't going the way they had planned. The battle was far from over, but the first major clash had already shown the humans' true strength. What had once seemed like an impossible fight was now turning into a clear victory for the human fleet. The enemy had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. On the battlefield, the tide was slowly but surely turning. The human fleet was no longer seen as a distraction or a token force. They were a powerful and dangerous opponent. The aliens had learned the hard way that humanity was not to be underestimated. And as the first wave of the battle continued, it was clear the human fleet had made its mark on the war. The battle raged on as the enemy, now visibly shaken, tried to regroup. The once confident alien forces were no longer as sure of their victory. The human fleet, with its unconventional tactics and unexpected agility, had forced the aliens into a corner. For the first time in the war, the galaxy's allies could see a glimmer of hope. On the bridge of the lead human ship, Captain Harris stood motionless, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The enemy had clearly underestimated the humans, but that was no longer the issue. The question now was, how could the humans maintain their momentum and finish the job? Status report, Harris ordered. A young officer turned to face him. Sir, we've taken down 30% of their fleet. They're starting to retreat, but there are still heavy forces remaining. Keep pressing, Harris replied calmly. We're not done yet. Despite the damage they had already inflicted, the human fleet knew that the worst was yet to come. The enemy was retreating, but they had regrouped, and their new strategy was designed to deal with the humans once and for all. The enemy was now fully aware of humanity's strength, and they would not be so easily defeated. Their larger ships, previously confident in their superiority, now circled around, ready to launch a final, overwhelming assault. The human fleet, however, wasn't going to back down. The ships continued to move in their unpredictable patterns, taking advantage of every opening, every gap in the enemy's formation. But there was something else at place, something the humans hadn't shown yet. It was the secret weapon the human fleet had been hiding. Something so powerful that it could change the course of the entire battle. The humans had been quiet about their new technology, a technology that had been developed in secret. It wasn't a new weapon or a larger ship. It was something much more strategic, a technological advantage that would shift the balance of power. The enemy had assumed that their superior firepower would be enough. They had believed that once they got close enough, they could finish the job. But the humans had other plans. As the enemy closed in, Captain Harris gave the order. All ships, activate the pulse weapon, he commanded. Without warning, a series of bright blue energy pulses erupted from the human fleet. It wasn't an attack meant to destroy. Instead, it was designed to disable. The pulses hit the enemy ships, sending out a wave of electromagnetic energy that short-circuited their systems. The aliens tried to react, but their communications were down, their weapons useless. The human pulse weapon had disabled the enemy's advanced technology in an instant. The enemy fleet, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now vulnerable. Their largest and most powerful ships, which had been at the center of their strategy, were now floating helplessly in space, their weapons and engines disabled. The tide of battle had shifted again, and this time it was in humanity's favor. Captain Harris watched as the chaos unfolded on the battlefield. The aliens, who had once been so sure of themselves, were now scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. They had relied on their advanced technology to win, but the humans had shown them that there were ways to fight beyond brute force. The human fleet had disrupted their technology, rendering them helpless in the midst of a war they thought they had already won. Continue the assault, Harris said. Don't give them a chance to recover. The human ships moved in once more, taking advantage of the now crippled enemy fleet. The humans didn't rush. They were methodical, working together to take down each ship with precision. The enemy, now panicked and disorganized, couldn't hold up against the human fleet's coordinated efforts. On the galactic side, the Allies were watching in awe. They had seen how the human fleet had disrupted the battle with its surprise tactics. But now they were witnessing the humans' true power. The pulse weapon wasn't just a technological marvel, it was a statement. The humans had something the enemy didn't: creativity, resourcefulness, and the will to win, no matter the odds. The alien commanders, realizing that their plans were falling apart, tried to regroup, but it was too late. The human fleet was relentless. They continued to move in with precision, targeting key areas of the enemy's ships. One by one, the enemy vessels were destroyed or disabled. The humans had outsmarted them at every turn. The enemy's final stronghold, their flagship, was now the only ship remaining. It was massive, heavily armored, and the last line of defense. The alien forces had placed all their hopes on this ship. But the human fleet wasn't intimidated. They had faced their worst and come out on top. Now it was time to finish what they had started, with a final, well-coordinated strike. The human fleet moved in, targeting the enemy flagship. The alien ship fired its weapons, but the humans easily dodged the blasts, working together to stay one step ahead. With a direct hit to the flagship's power core, the massive ship exploded in a brilliant display of light. The Warzone fell silent. The battle was over. The humans had done it. They had entered the Warzone with nothing but old ships and new ideas. And they had crushed an enemy that had once seemed invincible. The galaxy's allies were left in shock, witnessing humanity's unexpected victory, and the enemy. They were left with a clear message: never underestimate humanity. The Warzone had fallen silent for a brief moment. The once massive and powerful enemy fleet, which had dominated space for so long, was now in ruins. The human fleet had struck with such force and precision that the aliens were left with little to defend themselves. What had begun as a desperate attempt by humanity to make a difference had turned into a complete collapse of the enemy's forces. On the human fleet's led ship, Captain Harris stood quietly on the bridge, staring at the screens that showed the aftermath of the battle. The enemy flagship, once the symbol of their power, was now a cloud of debris floating in space. The enemy's smaller ships, which had tried to escape, were also falling one by one. It was a complete victory, but Harris knew that the battle wasn't over yet. There were still pockets of resistance, still enemies who refused to accept defeat. "Captain, the remaining enemy ships are trying to retreat," said Lieutenant Adams, his voice full of surprise. "But their engines are failing. They can't get away." Harris nodded. The pulse weapon had done its job well. The enemy had tried to regroup, but without their advanced technology working properly, they were powerless. The once proud fleet was now falling apart, and the few remaining ships were drifting aimlessly, unable to fight back. "Finish them off," Captain Harris ordered calmly. "We don't let them escape. Take no chances." The human fleet moved in. Their ships, which had once seemed outmatched and outdated, now felt like the most dangerous force in the galaxy. The aliens had underestimated them from the beginning. Now they were paying the price. As the remaining enemy ships attempted to flee, the humans pursued them relentlessly. The human fleet was no longer just a symbol of hope, it was now a force to be feared. The enemy ships tried to launch one last defensive strike, but it was too late. Their weapons were ineffective, and the humans responded quickly. Targeting weak points with deadly accuracy, one by one, the remaining alien ships were destroyed. It wasn't a quick and easy victory, but it was a steady, relentless process. The humans weren't in a rush. They were methodical. They had learned from the battle that power wasn't the only thing that mattered. Strategy, precision, and teamwork were the true keys to victory. As the last enemy ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, the human fleet remained quiet. There were no cheers or celebrations, just the cold realization that they had won. The enemy's once unbeatable fleet had crumbled in a matter of hours, reduced to nothing by the human fleet's determination and unexpected strength. The Allies, who had watched the battle from a distance, could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. They had expected a small force of outdated ships to be wiped out in minutes, but instead, they had seen humanity do the impossible. The alien fleet had been defeated, and the war zone, once a place of fear and despair, was now eerily calm. The Council of Galactic Defense had seen it all. They had watched as humanity, with its old ships and surprising tactics, brought down an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for so long. They knew they had underestimated the humans, but now they were forced to accept the truth. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were a force to be reckoned with. As the last of the enemy fleet was wiped out, Captain Harris allowed himself a moment of relief. It had been a long and difficult fight, but the results spoke for themselves. The human fleet had saved the day, and they had done it in a way that no one could have predicted. "Captain, the enemy fleet is gone," Lieutenant Adams reported, his voice filled with awe. "We've won." Harris took a deep breath, looking out at the vast emptiness of space. The war wasn't over, but this battle had changed everything. The galaxy's enemies now knew what humanity was capable of, and that would make all the difference in the fights to come. The human fleet wasn't just another player in the war. They had proven that they could turn the tide. And they had shown that, even against overwhelming odds, humanity would never back down. "We did it," Harris whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We did it." The crew echoed in unison, but even as the humans celebrated their victory, Harris couldn't forget the larger war that still loomed ahead. The enemy might have been defeated in this battle, but there were still more forces out there. Humanity's victory today had sent a clear message to the galaxy, but the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and as the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the war, one thing was certain. Humanity was no longer a fleet of outdated ships. They were a symbol of hope, strength, and resilience, a force that the galaxy's enemies would never be able to ignore again. The war zone was quiet now, eerily so. What had once been a chaotic, raging battle was now a field of wreckage. The alien fleet that had once struck fear into the hearts of the galaxy's allies was no more. The powerful ships once thought unbeatable now floated in ruins. It was a scene of utter destruction, but it was also a scene of triumph. The human fleet had won. They had done it in a way no one expected. Captain Harris stood at the front of his ship, staring out into space. The screens in front of him showed the aftermath, the remains of the enemy fleet scattered across the war zone. The human fleet had taken heavy damage, but it was nothing compared to the destruction they had caused. The battle had been fierce, but in the end, the humans had come out on top. "We've done it," Lieutenant Adams said, standing beside the captain. "We've wiped him out." Harris nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "What cost? We lost ships. We lost men. It's not over yet." The victory, though impressive, had come with a price. Several human ships had been damaged, and a few had been lost entirely. The battle had been tough, and while the humans had managed to surprise the enemy, it had taken all their strength and determination to do so. The humans had faced overwhelming odds and had emerged victorious, but the cost of war was always high. "We've shown them what we can do," Harris said, his voice low. "But the war's not over. This is just one battle." As the human fleet drifted through the war zone, the reality of what had been accomplished began to settle in. The enemies that had once laughed at the human ships that had thought them weak and outdated were now defeated. The allies across the galaxy were in shock. The message had been sent loud and clear. Humanity was not to be underestimated. The Council of Galactic Defense, who had initially doubted the humans, had now realized their mistake. They watched in stunned silence as the human fleet destroyed the last remnants of the alien force. The once dismissed human fleet was now seen as a powerful force in the galaxy. They had not only proved their worth, they had changed the course of the war. But even as humanity celebrated its victory, there was a quiet recognition that the fight wasn't over. The galaxy's enemies, now aware of humanity's power, would regroup. There would be more battles, more challenges ahead. The galaxy was still in turmoil, and the human fleet, though victorious, had no time to rest. "We've gained their respect," Harris said, turning back toward his officers. "But we've also made ourselves a target. They'll come after us again. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The crew on the bridge nodded in agreement. Everyone knew that the victory they had achieved was significant, but it was also a warning. Humanity had just made itself known to the galaxy, and while many would see them as heroes, others would see them as a threat. The war had just entered a new phase. As the human fleet began its journey back to the Allied territories, the mood on board was mixed. There was pride, of course, in what had been accomplished. But there was also an understanding of the road ahead. Humanity had proven that they could win against overwhelming odds. But the challenges of the galaxy's war were far from over. On the bridge, Captain Harris addressed his crew once again. "We've proven something today," he said, his voice steady. "We've proven that humanity is a force to be reckoned with. We've proven that no one can take us lightly. But we've also proven that we have a long way to go. The war isn't over, and our role in it has just begun." The crew responded with a mixture of quiet nods and determined expressions. Now, they had just achieved what seemed impossible, but they knew that the galaxy was vast, and the war was far from finished. The human fleet had made its mark, but there were still battles to be fought. Word of humanity's victory spread quickly throughout the galaxy. The allies who had once doubted the human fleet now saw them as the key to victory. The enemies, who had once underestimated humanity, now saw them as a real threat. Humanity had earned its place in the galaxy, and no one could deny it anymore. The human fleet had come to the Warzone with nothing but outdated ships and a strong will to fight. They had left a mark that would be remembered for generations. But even as the humans returned to their territories, the galaxy began to change. The once unstoppable alien forces now had to reckon with the power of humanity. Other alien races, who had watched from the sidelines, began to take notice. Some were cautious, seeing the humans as a potential ally. Others, more hostile, saw them as a challenge to their dominance. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it all. Captain Harris knew that the journey ahead would be difficult. There would be more enemies, more challenges, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. The humans had proven that they were more than capable of standing their ground. And now the rest of the galaxy would have to face the consequences of underestimating them. As the human fleet sailed back into the depths of space, a new chapter in the war was just beginning, and humanity would face it with the same strength, determination, and courage that had led them to victory.